Before I kind of get started, I think this is good just to take a step back and review Colossians. What have we learned? We've done 7 weeks on this. I'm hoping that something stuck, that y'all remember something. And if not, Google is really helpful in the next 5 minutes. So I just a quick question. So we're wrapping it up, and I've got a few words I want to say at the end about the messengers. I'm calling this the messengers, but let's go back to the beginning. So somebody tell me, why does this letter exist? What was going on in Colossae, in this church in Colossae, and why did Paul write this letter?
There were some people teaching heresy, and he was wanting to straighten them out and give them the truth.
Okay, so people were teaching heresy. So there was some cultural battle to try to win the hearts of this young church. They're very good. Does anybody remember what are the two major forces, the two major, pushes that were kind of that the Colossae church was getting on? There was two fronts, there was two sides. Does anybody remember what those two fronts were?
Are you talking about Gnosticism and versus Christianity?
Yeah. So there was two camps. So the Colossian church is being influenced by two very different religions that were existing in Colossae.
One of them was the Jews.
One was the Jews. So there's a large Jewish settlement there. So what would the Jewish philosophy be, and how would they have been trying to affect the Colossae church?
They still wanted to go by the law.
Yep, it was about the law. So they were saying, hey, look, this Jesus guy, he's pretty good, but you still got to follow the law. Does anybody remember there was another cultural force on the church in Colossae? Does anybody remember what that force was?
Somebody else's turn.
So where was Colossae? Was it in Israel?
No.
Where was it? Does anybody know?
It was in what is modern day Turkey, not too far from Ephesus.
Okay, very good. Who was ruling Turkey? Who was ruling Colossae?
Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire. Very good. Yeah, if y'all know the answer, just throw it right out there. And was the Roman Empire Catholic at this, or Christian at this time?
No.
So what was the religion of the Roman Empire?
Oh.
I'm sorry?
Pagan. Were they Catholic?
No, they weren't. They weren't Catholic yet. You're about 300 years early there. What was the Roman Empire during the first century, during the first church?
Oh, they were worshiping Caesar.
They were worshiping Caesar, but could we say they were polytheistic? They believed in multiple gods?
Yes.
And certainly, I think if y'all remember, there was some mysticism going on. There was certainly some Greek philosophy that was probably entering into this conversation. But regardless, there was this pagan side and there was this Jewish side. The pagan side was this mysticism, polytheism, and then there was Judaism, which was following the law. Is this all kind of ringing a bell just a little bit? Am I making any of this up?
No.
Just making sure. I mean, you got to watch me. Okay. So then, I'm sorry.
Follow your notes.
I've tried to. So my question is, what is Paul's suggestion to the Colossae church, the Colossians? What does he suggest is the solution to this? They're a young church. We could say that they're not a mature church. So what does he suggest is the solution to these two fronts, these two cultural fronts that are trying to affect it?
Well, he was wanting them to listen to the Christian faith that he's teaching.
Okay, listen to the Christian faith. He's trying to point them to something. What is he trying to point them to?
To Christ.
He's trying to point them to Christ. Would it be fair to say that and I actually going to talk about this a lot, or going to talk about this at the end a little bit more and put this in context. But is it fair to say the Colossians, the book of Colossians, is a book it's a letter about Jesus? Is that if you were to summarize this of what Paul is trying to tell them, the solution, could we just throw that out there and say Jesus, focused on Jesus, walk with Jesus, live in Jesus? Is that a fair summary of this letter?
I think so. Believe and accept Christ.
Okay. So my next question is, yes, sir.
I thought that he was writing the letter to the Christians at Colossae because of there being heresy in the church, and he wanted them to keep the faith, and he was telling them how they should live that faith out.
That's correct. I think that's a really fair statement. There's a heresy. The heresy is coming from these cultural. Is this a fair statement? You've got this heresy that's kind of springing up from these social pressures on both sides of the church. And he comes in and says, hey, look, this is how to become a mature Christian. This is how to live. And that live is focus on Christ, who he is, what he is, learn about him, think about him, walk in him. Is that what you're trying to say, Dennis, or do you disagree with that?
Well, yes, that's all of that is true, but it's really not a letter to the unsaved. It's a letter to those who already know Christ. And to watch, he's warning them about the heresy.
Well, are you saying that everybody in the church was saved?
Well,
when we're talking about the church, we're talking about the people who are Christians at the time, because it wouldn't do any good to tell them how they should live in Christ when they are unborn.
Yeah,
was everybody in that church were not necessarily Christians.
Yeah, that's definitely that's true, but he's addressing those that know Christ.
Yeah, let me say this. And by the way, if I 100% agree with you, Dennis. Clearly, this letter is written to Christians. It's not written to non-Christians. And so if I implied or said that incorrectly, I apologize. It is written to Christians in the Colossae church, but the church itself is immature. And that you're probably got lots of different people and lots of different, but for largely, can we say this is an immature church?
Yes.
And this immature church, Christians, there's a heresy. There is pressure, social pressure from other sides, some external, certainly people bringing baggage with them from their previous religious beliefs, and they're bringing it into the church. You've got outside people trying to come in and influence the church. They're trying to influence the Christians. They're trying to direct it to go to this way. And Paul is saying, no, this is the direction we need to go. We need to focus on Jesus Christ. Is that a more accurate statement, Dennis?
Yeah. Also that, any church that doesn't show, where the people don't show love, is an immature church.
Okay. So let's shift this slightly to, have we ever seen these kinds of challenges in the church since Colossae? Have we ever seen this? Was there ever some time in our history where there's outside cultural events that affects the church that changes the church, either changes it or is influencing the church? Did we ever see that in our history?
I think it's always going on.
Okay, so there's always this cultural push. By the way, I want to talk about today. That's my next question. But first, did we ever see in our history where the outside religions dramatically affected the church, where we incorporated ideas from the outside culture, outside religions into our church, and it dramatically changed the direction of our church? Did that happen to us?
Sure. That's why we have so many different denominations.
Yeah, we have. I mean, I completely agree. So there was this moment where the Reformation, where really a lot of these denominations kind of popped up because of the Reformation. But even before that, I was thinking of just the 300 Constantine in the 3rd century. There's the Christian church, the Roman emperor basically comes in and says, hey, look, the pagan church and the Christian church, hey, there's a lot of similarities there. And a lot of the beliefs, a lot of the religious holidays we have, you can kind of see some paganism that infiltrated the church. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, Paul and John, they were just on the onset of these heresies that were infiltrating the church. It wasn't until later when they really got bad, the heresies.
Yeah. Is there any pressure going on right now to the church? Cultural pressure on the church right now?
Absolutely.
What's some of that's happening right now?
Well, look at our church. It's completely different. It's from one pastor to the other, and the way that they're going. We had all the traditional music, the traditional will, and now we've got the up to date, I guess you call whatever you call, going toward the younger people, trying to draw the younger people in.
Okay, so let's draw a distinction here just a little bit, because I understand that. Would the music or the style of music necessarily be a heresy? Now, I can have my preference, you can have your preference. We can disagree with that preference, but that's not necessarily a heresy. Is that a fair statement?
Okay, I didn't think you were asking for heresies.
Oh yeah, no. I guess you're right, but you're right. There is pressure on the church to change directions. That's correct. I'm specifically trying to draw a parallel to the pressure on the Colossae church 2,000 years ago to pressure on the church today. Do we see any pressure from the culture to make us want to assimilate, to be a part of the culture more? Is there any pressure on the church for us to conform to the culture today? No?
I thought that's what we were talking about.
Perhaps I'm not asking the question well.
We're being pressured in the fact that I guess that we are to allow all different, how should I say this? We're being pressured by the LGBT.
Okay.
To let them have positions in the church.
That was when I was trying to brainstorm this question. That was one that I wrote down, was that there's certainly pressure from the culture within the church to be more open-minded. Would y'all agree with that statement?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else y'all would add to that? I mean, do we agree there's pressure from the outside, from the culture, to make the church be more acceptable to the culture, to those people who are outside the church? Is that yeah?
It's just anything that it seems like that would downplay the name of Jesus
Mhm.
and get our focus on something else.
Yeah. By the way, I think that's a really good point. Isn't that what exactly that happens to us today? Try to focus us off of Christ. Was that what was happening in the church in the Colossian church?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, Dennis agrees. What do you guys think? Does everybody else kind of agree that the same
Yes.
pressure that's happening to Colossians, take your eyes off of Jesus, put your eyes on your works or trying to find something above and outside of Jesus? That same pressure happens to us, just like it happened to them.
That's true.
Yeah. So these letters still apply to us. Would we? I mean, we would all agree to that. I would think. Correct.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that's the summary. If I was going to sum up the Colossian church, is the Colossian church, you've got this internally within the church, but you've got baggage we brought to the table, or maybe a little bit of self-righteousness. I'm not sure what's going on, but there are things going on within the church to take our eyes off of Christ. And Paul is saying, nope, let's focus on Christ. Let's become mature Christians by focusing on Christ. And how do you do that? And then there's some very practical things that he talks about within the letter. And those are the same pressure that they had, is the same pressure on us today. Is that are we all tracking that that's a good summary of that letter?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, good. Okay, good. So all that stuff I made up this morning worked. Okay, good. So let's go in. I do have a little bit of a lesson to talk about today. The last 12 verses of the chapter. So I want to do kind of bring it up at the end. And so this is the last lesson. I'm calling it the messengers. These are the people who either Paul had been traveling with, his friends, he's in prison. Remember, he's in prison. So he's in prison with some of these folks. And so at the end of the letter, Paul sends this greeting from these people that he's been traveling with. Basically, we can learn a few basic truths by learning a little bit about these messengers. Again, give you some background. Christ had died. He's died. He's been resurrected. The disciples are spreading the good news of Jesus's death and resurrection, and the church is growing rapidly. Colossae is one of the many new churches in that region in Asia Minor, and they're trying to figure out, what is this new religion? What does it mean? What are they supposed to do? And Paul has friends and coworkers that he uses to kind of lay down the foundation of this new religion. So Paul is literally teaching these new churches, what does it mean to be Christian? And so I just want to kind of go through a pretty quick lesson and just kind of talk about some of these messengers and see if we can see some Bible truths from it. I will tell you, I got basically 2 points. Number one, can we see these basic truths through these messengers? And can we see Jesus through these messengers, these companions of Paul? So let's read the first one. Tychicus will tell you, so I'm reading Colossians 4:7-18. Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He is a dear brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage our hearts. He is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, one who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. So again, first question right off. This is a letter. So we're reading this letter. And so if you're ever asked yourself, well, why is this in there? What's going on here? Remember, Paul is teaching the folks, he's teaching the people through a series of letters that he's writing. He's using these letters to educate, to kind of form the basis of this new church. A couple of things that just kind of pointed out to me. First of all, it's personal. These are the heroes of our faith. And we get to kind of read about, Paul's thoughts, his friends, his colleagues. And have you ever kind of take a step back and just think about, like, one of these days we're going to be in heaven and we're going to get to meet these guys. And what these guys, these are our heroes. I mean, if you think about what happened, Christ dies, he's resurrected. 12 men took the good news to what, now 1 billion people? I mean, I don't know how many Christians there are, but think about what has happened. These guys took this good news and they spread it to the world. And you and I have some, our faith. God used these guys to share the faith that's affected us. These are our heroes. These are the people that these are the teachers that spread this news that ultimately got to us. The New Testament was written by people, by pastors who were really trying to explain what this new religion is, what it's about. And these are his friends, and these are the people who are with Paul. The first one we read here is Tychicus. It's Paul's courier, and he's brought the letter. And Paul wants the church to know what's going on so that they can pray for him and participate in Paul's work. How does Paul describe Tychicus? How does he describe him? What does he say about him?
Says he's faithful to the word, and a friend of his, a faithful follower of him and the teacher of Christ.
Mm-hmm. So we see faithful. He's a faithful teacher. He's a faithful servant. So we see this word faithful. There's something else that I saw in that in his description. What does he call him?
His brother.
Calls him his brother. So there's this family, there's this unity, there's this relationship. So we see two things here. We see that there's relationship. There's this we have a physical family, but now we have this new, because of Christ, we have this new spiritual family. We have other Christians to rely on. And he's been steadfast. He's been persistent. He's been faithful. Then in verse 9, we go to this Onesimus. And again, we see the same phrase, brother. He's called brother. So again, we're starting to see, Paul is really kind of bringing this in. These are people that are close. There's a spiritual relationship. We're going to actually see Onesimus again next week when Lionel's reading Philemon. And Paul calls him son. So there's this very close relationship. And so anyway, so there's this closeness, there's this family, there's this togetherness. Then we skip to verse 10. My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort for me. So one thing that kind of stood out for me is that we see this name Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Does anybody remember Mark? Has anyone ever heard that name, the cousin of Barnabas, before? So Barnabas, or Barnabas's cousin from Acts, he was also called John. So Paul went, if you remember back in Acts 12, Paul went on a missionary trip with Barnabas, and Barnabas brought his cousin, John Mark. But in the next chapter, Acts 13, John Mark deserted them and didn't continue to work with them. He abandoned them. And we learned that Paul felt that John Mark had kind of abandoned them, abandoned the work, abandoned the mission. And later in Acts, we kind of found that Paul was really upset about this. He was really serious about this. And so that seriousness makes us kind of think that there was a seriousness to this, them leaving them kind of high and dry. And so later, Barnabas wants to take John Mark on another missionary trip, and Paul doesn't want to. And so it causes a rift in the family. There's a rift between Barnabas and Paul. And so Paul goes in one direction and Barnabas goes in another direction. But here, later, after those events, we see John Mark and Paul are back together. There's a relationship there again. And Paul is telling the Colossians to welcome him. And later in 2 Timothy, right before Paul's death, we learn that he calls John helpful, and which literally translates into the right-hand man, calls him his right-hand man. So here we see this John Mark let the faith down, he abandoned his work, he abandoned Paul, but now we see them restored. Is there any lesson for us in that story? By the way, John Mark was a Christian. So this was a Christian man who abandoned his work, abandoned his coworkers, and now we see this restoration.
Do we know why?
We don't know. We just know there was some seriousness there because Paul was pretty upset about it, about it enough to where there was a rift between him and Barnabas. But we don't know exactly what was not that I could find. Maybe somebody else has some other insight on that. But there was certainly a rift here, and Paul was pretty upset about it.
Yeah, you always have to forgive your brother.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how much they've hurt you.
Yeah. So forgiveness, I think that's a really great point. There's clearly forgiveness. There's restoration. There's restoration of John. Now, maybe I'm reading a little bit into this, but I'm suggesting here that maybe John Mark kind of fell away from the work, and he's coming back now. Do I know that? I don't, to be fair. But there's a sense that there was this falling away, this abandoning the work, abandoning the job, and there's this restoration. So one thing that I kind of picked up on this is that sometimes we get things wrong. As Christians, we fall, we stumble, but God is in the resurrection business. He restores, he resurrects, not just in the future, but the now. There's a song called Vice Verses that says there's a little resurrection every time I fall. And I see that. And so I think that reminds me a little bit of John Mark. There's restoration, there's resurrection. God is in the resurrection business. And then we go to verse 12. Again, these are all just kind of greetings. And it's always just kind of interesting to kind of go back and look and see, hey, look, who are these folks? And can we learn anything from these folks? Or do we just read through these verses and is there something we can learn there? So verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he is working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis, just like Onesimus. Epaphras is one of them. He's come from the Colossian church. A little bit of background: Epaphras was the one who started the church, and he left to go find answers because these outsiders are invading. They're bringing this heresy into the church to the Christians. He loves the church and he's struggling for the church. We see this verse, he is always wrestling in prayer for you that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. What in the world does that mean? He's always wrestling in prayer for you. What is going on there?
He knows that the problem they're having, and he's praying against this invasion.
Yeah.
Of
So
people.
he's praying.
He's trying to trick them. He's trying to strengthen them in that faith.
Yeah, trying to strengthen them in that faith. He's praying. He's participating. Anything else stands out to you about this? Anybody?
The English Standard Version says he's always struggling on your behalf in his prayers.
Okay, always struggling on your Yeah.
They would be mature and fully assured in the will of God.
Yeah. You know,
It
when
just means that he was being very serious with his prayers.
yeah, I when I read that, I'm very fascinated by the very proactive nature of praying. It's very active. It's not something, it's not this pious ancillary activity. It's part of the work. There's the prayer is you're participating, we're working, we're part of the struggle. We're not just, we're active, we're part of that. We're part of what's going on. That's what kind of stuck out to me when I see words like wrestling, struggling with, that the prayer is not some kind of docile thing that we do and we say a quick prayer, but this is actually being part of God's work, that's kind of what stuck out to me about it. Then in verse 14, it says, our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. After this letter has been read to you, see that it has been read to the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from the Laodicea. So first of all, just for fun, who is this Luke guy? We heard that guy before. Who's Luke?
Dr. Luke.
He is a writer, one of the
He wrote really
writers.
Yeah, he wrote a somewhat famous book called Luke in the Bible. He also wrote another somewhat famous book called Acts. So we see, and by the way, this is how we know he's a doctor, because it lets us know that. Remember what I said earlier, this Paul, Luke, these guys, these are the heroes of the first century church. They're together, they're praying together. By the way, you ever just stopped and thought about this prayer meeting? Can you imagine the conversations that's taking place? To me, this is good stuff. This is fascinating stuff. One day it's going to be like that for us. One day you're going to discuss Colossians with Paul. One day you're going to be able to discuss Revelations with John. One day we're going to be able to discuss Leviticus with Jesus. That's going to be an interesting conversation. By the way, if this doesn't light your fire, your wood's wet, guys. These are people who wrote our faith. They drew it out for us. They helped us establish our faith. They're together. They're praying together. They're figuring it out. God's using them to write and to lay out the foundation of what we believe. Notice, I'm sorry.
I said, in the battle, they are the leaders. They're the generals.
They are the generals. They are the first generals on the field, laying down the battle plan that has affected and changed everybody on this call. I would venture to say no one on this call right now has not been affected by the work of Paul and Luke and the people who were in that group, that were traveling together, that were imprisoned together. Is that a fair statement? Would y'all agree with that?
Yes.
And one day we're going to meet these guys, and that's pretty darn exciting. Notice in verse 16, he says, read the letter from the church of the Laodiceans. A couple of quick points about this that was just kind of fascinating to me, just on church history. Paul clearly, when he's writing these letters, he is intending for them to be passed around, to be shared, to be saved. These letters are really designed to lay the foundations for this new worldwide church. Paul knows, Luke knows, these guys know what it is. And just FYI, so what is this letter? Read the letter in the church of the Laodiceans or from the Laodicea. So what letter is this? Well, we don't know for sure. Dennis mentioned earlier that Colossae was close to the Ephesians. I think a pretty strong possibility is that this is the letter of, the Ephesian letter, the book of Ephesians in the Bible, that not only did Paul write that for the Ephesians, but he wrote that for all of the Ephesians to be read, not only to the Ephesian church, but also to Colossian and other churches in Asia Minor. What I did not know until I did the study was that some of the early manuscripts of the Ephesian letter didn't even actually mention Ephesus. So clearly Paul was writing this to be kind of shared around. One of the things, remember, who's taking this letter is Tychicus is taking this letter to the Colossae church. If you go back to Ephesians in chapter 6, it was the same guy, Tychicus, who was doing the same thing with the letter from the Ephesians. He was taking the Ephesian letter out to the different churches. Again, these are again, if we've been affected, if the foundations of our faith was laid out by Paul, it was Tychicus who had possession of these letters, and he's taking them to the different churches and he's reading them out loud. He's kind of imagining the value of this possession in this is precious cargo that he's going around. But regardless, Paul intends for these letters. He intends for that first century church to read these. And I think he intends for us to read these today. And these are to us, they're to Christians, and the same struggles that's happening to Colossae is happening to us today. And he wants us to read them. These are instructions for us, just like it was for them. And then 17 and 18, tell Archippus, see to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord. And then 18, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains, grace be with you. So Paul is in chains, he's in prison. He's suggesting the chains are worth it, but it's hard. He's not suggesting that it's easy. Let's not forget this. We live in America. Would we agree? So America has been the freest religious freedom in our society than any other country in the history of the planet. We can worship freely. We can pray freely. And not only do we live in the United States, but we live in Texas. We live in the Bible Belt. I can go and pray at a meal at a busy restaurant, and people will barely bat an eye. So there's not a lot of religious persecution going on. Is that true in the world?
No.
That is not true. People in other countries are struggling. They're either in chains or they fear, they live in fear of chains. But Paul is letting us know the chains are worth it, but the chains are hard. Paul doesn't want us to forget that there's been blood and tears spilled to get you this good news. Are we thankful? Does this affect us? Are we thankful? Or do we take it for granted? I can speak for myself. Sometimes I take this for granted. And here's my last point. If you went back to Colossae, the letter for the Colossians, and you just literally went through and highlighted or underlined every time Jesus was mentioned in this book, the name Jesus or Christ or for him, his will, the cross, every time he was mentioned, he would show up 63 times. There are 95 total verses in Colossians, and Jesus is referred to 63 times. This is a book. This is a letter about Jesus. Paul wants us to know about Jesus. Paul wants us. How does the world what does the world think? Not Christians, but what does the world think is the way to get into heaven?
Work your way.
Work your way, follow the rules, be good. What is the gospel's way? What does the gospel say is the way to get into heaven?
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved.
That's right. It's about the cross. It's about Jesus. Chris Langham, who I've talked about this before, he's got a podcast called Through the Word. He has a quote, walking in rules is a guilt trip. Walking in Jesus is a grace trip. It's a trip. It's a journey in grace. Isn't that different?
Yes.
our natural inclination is to go back to rules, just like the Colossians. The Jewish faith is trying to invade there and say, hey, look, you got to follow the rules. It's about the rules. It's about the commandment. It's about Leviticus. It's about the Old Testament law. And what happens to people who think about the rules all day, who think about the laws all day, worried about breaking the rules all the time? It creates grumpy, unloving, judgmental, self-righteous people that non-Christians don't want to be around. Paul suggests we walk in Jesus, that we live in that faith, that he wants us to put our eyes on that, on the cross, on Jesus, he wants us to read about Jesus. He wants us to talk about Jesus. He wants us to think about Jesus. Jesus changes everything. God knew what was going to happen when he gave us free will. The world would fall apart. We would try to kill each other. We would lie to each other. We would steal from each other. But God gave us Jesus. And when we place our eyes on Jesus, God knows what happens to that too. There's freedom. There's love. There's family. There's relationship. There's restoration. There's resurrection. There's hope. In Philippians 3:10, Paul told the Philippians, I want to know Christ. I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of the resurrection and participation in the sufferings, becoming like him in death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. I want to know Christ. I want to think how Christ thinks. He wants us to have this power that comes from Christ's death and Christ's resurrection. Paul is trying to tell us this Jesus, he's a game changer. His cross changes everything. The resurrection changes everything. If you want a summary, if you want to put an exclamation point on the letter from the book of Colossians, it's the resurrection changes things, and that power, there's grace, there's love, there's future. That's all from that cross. It's from what Jesus gave us.